This is a video about 8 ways to improve your TOK essay. A lot of these ideas can be used to help other essays too, but it's focused on the IB Theory of Knowledge essay. First way to improve your TOK essay is by talking about knowledge throughout. In other words, you want to discuss knowledge throughout the entire essay. As you know, the subject TOK, Theory of Knowledge, is about the fundamental question: how do we know what we know? Right? That's the fundamental knowledge question of TOK. All of the titles that you're going to get from the IB are knowledge questions. So the whole point of this essay is to have a discussion about knowledge. People go wrong when they start making the essay not so much a discussion or dialogue about knowledge, but a report. You don't want to do that. You don't want to slide into just pumping in information, plugging it from Wikipedia or internet in there. This is not a report. And that comes in especially when you have your real life examples, right? Your real life situations. You can't just allow those to balloon. Okay, so we'll talk more about that later, but you want to talk about knowledge throughout. The words, what does that mean? Words like knowing, knowledge, knower, know, understanding, things like that, they should be coming up throughout your essay. I keep saying the word throughout because not just in the beginning and not just in the end and not just once in a while. You got to talk about knowledge throughout the entire essay. I have an analogy. A lot of students do this. They start off the essay with a knowledge question. They bring up some knowledge questions in their introduction. But then once they actually go into the actual body of the essay, it's kind of like a scuba diver. They start outside the pool over here, right? But then they go underwater and you don't see them talk about knowledge the whole rest of the way until they come up in the concluding paragraph, and all of a sudden they're talking about knowledge again at the end. So you forgot the whole middle of the essay, right? So you don't want to be like a scuba diver where you only talk about knowledge at the beginning and the end, and the rest of the essay you're underwater. You want to be talking about knowledge from the whole way through. The second way to improve your TOK essay, this is a big one, is by making your knowledge claims contestable. Contestable. If you look in the definition of a knowledge question in TOK, a knowledge question, part of it is that it's contestable, right? It has to be something that's actually has sides to it, that has multiple sides. If you say, the sky is blue, it's like, yeah, that's great. It's not really a contestable question. It's sometimes maybe purple or red or whatever, but basically the sky is blue. So you want to choose for your knowledge claims, which are going to make up the guide, the center of your paper. You want to make those claims that someone could actually argue about. Just think about it. If it's not contestable, where are you going to go with it, right? How are you going to have a claim and then a counterclaim to oppose it, right? Because there's not going to be anything to argue about. But you want that, okay? So this is what happens often if you see a student. They'll come in their first draft and they say, I got like 3 sentences, but I don't know what to write, right, about my knowledge claim. Well, yeah, because what you have as a knowledge claim is a statement that's obvious, right, or that doesn't require any unpacking, any explaining, or anything like that. So your claim should be contestable, and it should be substantial enough to require explaining or unpacking, right? Something that has many sides to the issue. Along those lines, the third way of improving your TOK essay is by understanding what we really mean by a counterclaim. I didn't even realize this was an issue until I taught TOK, and I said, oh, people maybe don't understand what it means. When often teachers will give a framework where they say for a TOK essay, it's not the only framework, where you have an intro and conclusion, kind of the bread and the sandwich, intro and conclusion. In the middle, you have a claim and a counterclaim, one, and a claim and a counterclaim, two. That's okay, that works. That's a standard format. But just to be clear, a counterclaim is not just another claim, not just an alternative like this, like, apples and oranges. It's a claim that refutes or contradicts the first claim, right? It's not just an alternative claim, it's saying the opposite. So you can think of it like being in court. One lawyer gives their side of the story, then he sits down and the other lawyer has a counter argument. Okay? It's the same thing, a counterclaim. You're countering the first claim. That's just an important thing to realize. Second thing about that, though, is also if you're going to use that format, go ahead and do a counterclaim that really refutes the first one. But you don't necessarily have to use that format. Your format doesn't have to be claim counterclaim. It could also just be multiple perspectives. Because if you actually look in the IB TOK guide, what you're being graded on is more that you entertained or kind of looked at more than one side of the issue, more than one perspective. So, for example, you might say, well, on this particular issue, Plato said this. That's your claim, right? And then an Aristotelian view from Aristotle may be this other thing, B. And then something else from later, like Machiavelli, might say C. And they might actually agree on a bunch of stuff, but also disagree on others, right? So each one is not necessarily a counterclaim like directly against. You're just kind of providing apples, oranges, bananas, or just three different perspectives on the same thing, as opposed to every single one like two lawyers who are totally opposing each other. Okay, so you can also have just multiple perspectives, but they have to be different. That's the main thing. Another important way that you can improve your TOK essay is by focusing on the how, not just the that it exists, but how, because that's what the TOK questions are going to be asking you, things like that. For example, the main TOK umbrella question that overarches all of the class is how do we know what we know? Okay, so it's not just saying do we know what we know, it's how do we know. And if we take that, let's look at an example of an actual TOK question. For example, the IB might give you an essay title like how do we know where the ethical boundaries are in research? Okay, and then pick two areas of knowledge. Or how do we know what, this is a past question, how do we know what constitutes a good or bad interpretation in different areas, in arts and music and biology or whatever it might be? How do we know? Okay. And what students sometimes do is they kind of go a step and then they don't take the next step. In other words, they'll explain real life situations and they'll show that we could know where the boundaries are in a certain situation, that there was a lab experiment and they went too far. Okay, right? Or somebody interpreted the art and they did a bad job and it was a bad interpretation. Somebody else did another interpretation, it was good. So they show that you can make a good or bad interpretation. They show that there are ethical boundaries in lab research, etc. But they don't fully answer the question because the question is asking not just did they or can we, it's how. How do we know, right? All the TOK questions are all always about gray areas. They're never about black and white. Okay, so that's what you want to kind of keep an eye out for is are you answering the how part, the how we know? And for that, what it would be something like, okay, there are boundaries in lab experiments. What are they? Identify what they are. What are, give us some criteria for what makes a legitimate ethical lab experiment. What exactly is that line and what makes an unethical lab experiment? The same way, what exactly are the criteria that make a good interpretation in art, in literature, whatever, versus a bad interpretation, right? And if you can identify criteria like that somebody could use, then you are showing the how. And I get it. It's easy. These days, it's easy to just fill up an essay by copying and pasting info from Wikipedia, digging up stuff from over here and shoveling it over here. That is fundamentally not what the TOK essay is, though, right? The TOK essay is not a report. Can't say it enough. It's a dialogue about knowledge. It's entertaining multiple perspectives on knowledge questions. Most people in life, not just in school, have never written any essays like that before. Okay, an essay about knowledge itself. And a good TOK essay reads like a conversation between intelligent people having a dialogue about how do we know what we know about knowledge questions. Okay, it doesn't read like a report. It's really easy. I totally get it. It's easy to slip into the report mode because that's what a lot of classes require. But you just have to keep like tapping yourself and reminding yourself, don't slip into that mode. Okay, don't go on too long, more than 4 or 5 lines in describing your real life situations. Okay, that takes effort, right? Like the saying goes, I'm sorry for this long letter, I didn't have time to write a short one, right? It takes talent and it takes time to shrink a topic down to a small few lines, but that's what you got to do. Okay, now we're getting into some ways to improve your TOK essay, which can apply to many types of writing. And these are some of my favorites because I use these myself. I'm a journalist, so I love to use these myself, and it's always helped me. These are things that sometimes are uncomfortable to do for me or anybody because that's where you grow, is in the uncomfortable areas. Okay, so one of the best ways that you can improve your TOK essay, and this is so TOK, okay, is by widening the lens, or as a journalist named Amanda Ripley says it, complicating the narrative. Okay, complicate the narrative. In other words, what that means is that a lot of times when we write things, we have something we think we want to say, right? I think I understand the issue. Now I want to just explain to people what I want to say, prove it, etc. That's great. But as you investigate a particular topic, okay, you have that idea in your mind that I want to say this, something comes along and it's like, oh no, this evidence actually throws a wrench in things. Things aren't quite as simple as I thought, right? This is kind of like a counter argument that there's some actual merit to that, right? And our first instinct a lot of times is to figure out a way to brush it aside, right? Sweep it under the rug, ignore it, right? So our first instinct is actually to narrow the lens, right? To just ignore that, skip the tunnel vision, and just plug away on the train and get this essay out of here, okay? What happens when you do that is that two things. A, you have a worse essay because you didn't really fully explore the topic. But B, you set yourself up to be nailed because if you could be that you're completely ignoring something that could blow your whole argument out of the water, right? That somebody could bring that up and say this argument makes no sense, and it could be that you get to the end later and you realize that, and you have to go all the way back to the beginning and start over again. Okay, so instead of ignoring information and avoiding information and sweeping it under the rug when it contradicts your claims at first, and narrowing the lens, widen the lens. Don't be afraid to complicate the narrative. Invite complexity. Invite, because I want to go into the abyss. I want to go into the darkness. Okay. Amplify and explore the contradictions. Somebody contradicts with your view, face right at it and say, okay, now why is that? What exactly are they saying? Right? Because if you are correct, then you ought to be able to show it again. To explain why against an argument. Right? It's like the old saying, if you don't understand the other person's argument, then you really don't understand yours either, right? If someone's arguing against you, if you can't even understand all the reasons why somebody would disagree, then you don't fully understand your own argument, okay? So how can this help you? By widening the lens, it often shows where the boundaries are between two views. You have a view, somebody else has a view, and there's like a gray area in it where this view becomes that view. There's some evidence, some points where the people fall to one side or the other, and that's where the boundaries are. And by listening to the other side and amplifying the reasons why those people, listening carefully to why people might disagree or schools of thought disagree, you start to see where the limitations are of your argument, where the boundaries are between different views. It's not saying give up your point of view. It's not saying just, I'm wrong and I give up. No. It's saying that you actually be stronger in your position if you come out the other side having entertained all of the objections. The master of this was, for example, was a guy named Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages, who wrote this book, Summa Theologica, who basically entertained any possible objections that anyone he could ever, find out there, and he wrote them down, and then he wrote a response to them. Right, so he was just looking for people who objected, so that he could sort of make a log of it, and he defended against every objection you could possibly think of, and that's why the book is so thick. Okay, and why do we want to do all this? Because that's what you want to be talking about in TOK. You want to be talking about gray areas. Okay, so you like gray areas. You like the unknowns, the middle grounds. That's why TOK questions are often asked as to what extent. To what extent? You will never get a black and white question, a question with a black and white answer in a TOK essay title, right? That you'll never get that. It's never like this is the answer versus that. It's always, how do we know? Where's the middle ground? Where's the boundary? You have to find the boundary, right? It's never going to be the boundaries given to you from the start. Okay, so you're kind of like exploring the territory, widening the lens, amplifying the contradictions, complicating the narrative. There's a fantastic, I hope you check this out. This journalist named Amanda Ripley, she wrote this fantastic article called 22 Questions to Complicate the Narrative. And then she made videos about it too. It's so good. And what they did was they took people who are professional negotiators or conflict mediators, and she basically wanted to do better, less polarized journalism. So she interviewed them and took sort of the highlight reel of the best tips that they have, and she brought those to journalists, and it vastly improved their reporting. Okay, so do yourself a favor for life, not just for the TOK essay, but sink your teeth into that 22 questions that complicate the narrative. It's such so useful. She's a great mind thinking about that stuff. That brings us to another way to improve your TOK essay, which is along the same lines, which is avoid making sweeping generalizations that don't sweep. Okay, the historian John Lukács said that don't make sweeping generalizations that don't sweep. It's okay to make a generalization as long as it sweeps, right? But a lot of times what people make is when they start out their knowledge claims, sort of like everybody can see, and then it's like, nope, actually no, it's not true because it's only half the time, and there's something about it that's not true all the time. Okay, it's one of the most bread and butter basic things that I've had to correct in TOK essay drafts is entire sections that are based on a statement that's made as a universal statement, and it's just obviously not true all the time. And so you're not going to be able to defend it because there's easily going to be able to somebody poke holes in your statement. Okay, so it kind of goes back to the previous one. What do we do about that? Um, Mine the gray areas, right? Mine the gray areas. So it's not black and white. Okay, but just because it's black and white, it's just not black and white, doesn't mean it's not worth looking at. You take that same statement, okay, and if I say, well, to the student, well, that's not black and white, the response doesn't have to be, well, I guess I just throw it in the trash can. No. If it's not black and white, then there's gray area, then explore that, right? Say, okay, to what extent is it true? How much of it is true? And where is the boundary when it's true and then it stops being true, where it becomes less true? Where are the exceptions to the rule, right? And et cetera, et cetera. How do we know? Okay, those are our knowledge questions. How do we know? How do we know what we know? Okay, that's fun. That's a good chance to explore. So embrace the fact that you may have black and white universal statements that don't always uh, they're not always true. You may have sweeping generalizations that don't sweep, but there's a way to actually turn that into gold by seeing, okay, it doesn't always sweep, but when doesn't it sweep, right? What exactly is that boundary and how can I tell? Then we're really getting into TOK questions. The last way to improve your TOK essay is more of a macro level one about the process that you engage in as you do your TOK essay. And this, I think, is really important. It may take a little bit of effort, but this is how a TOK essay is really supposed to be written. I would say many, if not most students, don't do this. Um, to improve your TOK essay, you want to make it an experience where you are engaged in a dialogue. Okay, a dialogue. The dialogue between many, many things. You yourself, great ideas, other teachers who are subject experts in your areas of knowledge, even anyone else who's interested in those things, like YouTube videos about your topics, or other students who really like science, really like art, whatever it might be, your parents, anybody that you can find who has something they could lend to your essay. Okay, so you can kind of think of yourself like you're the hub in the wheel, right? You're the center of the wheel, and all these other things that you can engage with, and your TOK essay is almost like the product of this dialogue, this great conversation about how do we know what we know, and your essay question that ends up on the page. Some people say that great TOK essays, you can even see sort of the conversational nature of it, how it's just ideas going back and forth. They're responding to each other. That's true, but, and then you go back and forth, right? So that may be difficult. It may be easy. Sometimes other teachers are, sort of not willing to help as much at certain schools. It just depends where you go. In my experience, they have been, but others too. I know from tutoring that not always the case. Um, but it should be the case because it says in the IB guide that they want it to be like that. They want it to be a dialogue with the student and other people. At many schools, the teachers of IB subjects besides TOK are supposed to be including TOK in their subjects. So if you have a chemistry IB book, a textbook, or a geography or history, whatever, there's going to be a little boxes in the side, right, where it says TOK connection, right, and they have a little blurb or something that connects chemistry or physics or whatever to TOK. So those teachers are actually supposed to be incorporating TOK into their own classes. So it shouldn't be any skin off their back or anything unusual for them to help you out. Some of the most successful experiences that I've had teaching TOK are actually when I have been able to connect students who were struggling or whatever, or even students who are really advanced, with a teacher like in a particular area. Okay, I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I was teaching, and we had a really good guy. It was a chemistry, I think it's physics actually, science teacher. And he volunteered. I put out a sort of WhatsApp message. Does anybody want to help my TOK students with their essays in their subject areas? And I had about 5 people volunteered. And the student that went to this guy was looking for connections between math and science, like how do they work together or not, the areas of knowledge. And this teacher was really an encyclopedia of science knowledge, and he came up with ways that I think it was Kepler, if I'm not mistaken, some of the guys who discovered and proved that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but the sun, and they had to track the orbits of the planets and things like that. He showed how they had to actually create and invent new math in order to do science, or do astronomy, right? So in the process of science, of astronomy, they invented math, so certain types of math, geometry. So that was awesome. He used that in his paper. It was a great thing, and he got a much better grade. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that you could rummage around in the internet forever. But if you talk to a teacher who does this stuff every day, and they have graduate, school degrees and stuff, they often can help you and just jump right over these kinds of obstacles. The other aspect of making a dialogue out of the process of your TOK essay is in using what I call the bag of tricks in your AOK, in your area of knowledge. And I think so. The great essays do this really well. Um, the other ones, what happens is you end up writing in a vacuum. This is one of the big things you don't want to do. You do not want to write in a vacuum. You don't want to write without talking to other people about your paper, but you also don't want to write without consulting, so to speak, the great minds of your own AOK, right? It's like, how could you write a paper about the theory of relativity without some quotes from Einstein or some equation? Like you have to have the great thinkers in there. But the big thing to realize is that whatever AOKs you choose, whether it's arts or life science, natural sciences, or physical science, whatever it might be, you should get familiar with who the great thinkers are, the great theories are, the great schools of thought. All right. A lot of students aren't even aware that there are schools of thought on their topics. But if they just kind of tap into that, they start to realize that sort of knowledge claims just fall out into their hands, because people have been making knowledge claims since the beginning of knowledge, since philosophy began. Okay, so there's all kinds of sort of ready-made arguments out there that you can use from past schools of thought and great thinkers that some students never even see them, and yet they are exactly the kind of thing that belongs in a TOK essay. So to sum it up, the TOK essay is all about exploring. It's about exploring a topic in depth. And you only have 1,600 words to do it. It's not a lot of words. So there's no room for filler. There's no room for just shoveling stuff off the internet, stuff like that. It's got to be a very unique thing. It's a very personal thing because it's your thought process, your personal dialogue in your mind, a conversation. And the goal of the whole TOK essay, as the IB states it, is to get, it's like the light of fire, to get a conversation, a dialogue in you that will continue into the future. So all these ways of improving your essay will help you do that. Good luck.